Hey guys, and welcome to Graphic Designer Pro, and welcome to another live Q&A session. And now I say these are live Q&A sessions, they are also tutorials. So today we are going to be taking a look at the envelope distort features in Adobe Illustrator 2021. These are some really useful features to get to know, especially if you haven't ever used them before. It's a great way to warp your designs within the software. So we're going to jump into that, and of course, if you have any questions, I'll be checking the chat intermittently. So if you have any questions along the way, whether it's to do with what we're looking at in the tutorial or something completely separate related to design, I'm here to answer your questions. So let's jump straight into Illustrator now, and we will just get stuck in with this. So as you can see, we already have some elements already set up that we are going to use to demonstrate how these features work. So fairly simple elements, but this will still give you a good idea of how they can be used, and I would argue that these features almost work better with more simplified elements anyway, so you'll see what I mean hopefully. But we're going to start in the top left here. So we have this simple flag design here. So this is all outlined. You can see if I press Command Y here, this is all, converted to outlines, paths. Now you'll see with all of these that we don't actually have to outline text with them. We can do this. We can use all of these envelope distort features with live text. So that's one of the big benefits of it as well. So let's just flip back here. The other thing to note here as well is that none of this is actually grouped here. We've got some lines that are grouped, but really all of these are separate elements. So we don't even have to actually have all of this grouped initially. Normally I would recommend to group it, especially when we're using the warp features that we're about to look at. It can deliver better results if the elements are grouped. So what I'm going to do is just click and drag over all of these, press Command G, or that's Control G on a PC, that's the keyboard shortcut. You can of course right click and then click group as well. Now to find the envelope distort features, we need to go up to Object in our top menu. Now you may not actually be able to see this in the live stream, but it basically just sits up in this top menu here. And then we have envelope distort further down, and we actually have three options to choose from. So we're going to start by looking at make with warp. Now, if you're familiar with the warp effects in Illustrator, this is basically the exact same thing. So this is just a different way of selecting one of those warp effects. Now we also have this envelope options option here as well, but we're going to show you how to get to that after applying one of these anyway. So we're not going to click on that for now. We're going to click on make with warp, and this is going to remember the last settings that I had set. So you can see, well, hopefully you'll be able to see we have our warp options dialog box here, and we have this set to wave. Now if I drop this down, these are our default warp presets essentially that we can choose from. So this is the exact same as if you were to go through effect and then choose your warp effect from there. So we can choose things like arc, and I can just basically scroll through these and see what each one does. One thing I would recommend is always set the horizontal and vertical settings to 0% to begin with at least, and then you can get a better idea of what the warp is actually doing. So in this case it's arc upper, and you can see in our preview here, make sure preview's checked as well, it's arcing the top portion of our design here. So what I'm going to do in this case, we've got this flag type design, so I'm going to select the flag preset, and you can see this is automatically creating this flag like warp to our design here. So we've got this bend value, this is a percentage value. I would always basically go with I always think with these kinds of effects, less is more. You can see I can boost this right up and make it really crazy, but it just doesn't look very good if you do that. I would always tend to, go with a slightly more subtle look. I think anywhere between 0 and 20-25% is going to give you pretty nice results a lot of the time. Now we do also have these horizontal and vertical percentages. Like I say, that's going to kind of warp the perspective of it a bit. Personally, I tend to always just keep these at 0. I think it gives for a nicer look normally with what I'm doing. And then if you wanted to apply a bit of perspective, you can always use things like the free transform tool afterwards. We're not going to get into that in this video though. So I'm just going to go with this 16% bend and 0% for my horizontal and vertical values. Click OK, and you can see what's happening. So it's automatically being applied. You'll notice these blue paths have appeared, and this is basically creating a mesh over our design. That this is basically kind of telling it how to warp the shape. So we can actually go and play around with this mesh more if we wanted to with our direct selection tool. But in this case, we're going to look at that more in the next example anyway, because that's our next envelope distort option, is to make with a mesh. So yeah, really easy to use. I can always go back and edit it as well. If I click off this, if I click back on, up in my control bar, you'll see I have a few icons here. So if you don't have the control bar set up on your workspace, I would personally recommend it. I think it's very useful to have. You can access it by going up to Window and then Control. So it just gives you some more options when you're dealing with your selections. We do have it over in our quick actions in our properties as well, but I prefer having it up in the control panel. So the option on the left, top left, says edit envelope, and that will be selected by default. If you click the one to the right of it, that says edit contents. So that's going to basically enable our original selection and again, and we can, edit the actual design itself. The other thing to do is, if you were happy with the way it's looking, you can see that if I press Command Y again, we're not actually seeing our design. If I was to go back over to the edit contents, we'll see it, but it's not being applied in that wave-like appearance that we're seeing it right now. So I would have to go and expand this. So again, to do that, it's just going up to Object in the top menu and then down to Expand. Make sure Object and Fill are selected, and then just click OK. And now our paths are adhering to that wave effect that we've created. So very simple to use, and we can get quite creative with this. You can see we've got some live text here. So if I press T on my keyboard, this is completely editable text. So this is just an example of using it on live text as well. So let's go back up to Object, down to Envelope Distort, and then Make with Warp. The keyboard shortcut on a Mac is Option Shift Command W, so it's a little bit of a tricky one to remember. Personally, I always just go through the menu. I think on a PC that would be Alt Shift Control W instead, but always worth knowing the keyboard shortcuts. So you can see it's remembering the last settings we had applied. Let's drop the style drop down again, and this time I'm going to go for this wave style. So it's going to basically keep the text in the same proportions. It's not warping the edges of the text, but within it we've got this kind of wave effect going on. Again, 16% I think is fine for an example like this, so I'll just go ahead and click OK, and there you have it. And this is still completely editable. So grab my type tool. What I would need to do is click on that icon again, or what you can also do is just double click into it, and you can see we've got our text here. So again, T on my keyboard, and I could change this to say wave instead. And yeah, there you go. Very, very simple to use. And yeah, just basically with the first one, it's just another way of applying these warp effects. So it's not really that different to what we would normally do. But let's move on to our next example. So we've got some more live text here. And again, this applies to live text or outlined designs, paths. So you can do it with either. I'm going to go back up to Object, down to Envelope Distort, and then Make with Mesh. So just quickly before we do that, if I click back on our text here, and let's click on the Edit Envelope shortcut icon in the top right, like I was saying, we've got these kind of blue paths here. So this is basically automatically applying a mesh based on the warp parameters that we're applying. Now, the Make with Mesh option basically is doing the same thing, but it's doing it from more of a base level. So I'll show you what I mean. Let's go up to Object, Envelope Distort, and then Make with Mesh. And now we get a pop-up, and we've got basically a choice of how many rows and columns we want to add. So you can see I'm adjusting this, and it's editing the number of rows being placed. This is basically creating a grid that we can then go and customize ourselves. So I'm just going to stick with 4 rows and 1 column. I'm going to create a kind of wave effect with this, and I'm going to click OK. So nothing is going to change on the surface of it, but we now have this mesh grid applied to it. So if I grab my direct selection tool, I can basically click on any of these points, and they already have curve handles applied to them. So if you're familiar with working with the pen tool, for example, when we drag out these Bezier curves, we can apply curvature to these lines. If I just click and drag on one of them, you can kind of see what's happening. I'm basically dragging a point and it's distorting the text based on where I drag it. So I can do this with any one of these points. I could grab multiple points as well. So I could just click and drag on these, for example, and we're already getting quite a cool effect with that. So this is basically doing the same thing as our envelope distort with a warp, but we're doing it from scratch. So there's no kind of presets applied to this. We can create our own grid and edit it in our own way. Now, one thing to note is if I go back to my selection tool, I'll just click on this again. We have another icon up here that's our envelope options. So as I mentioned before, we can go up to Object, Envelope Distort, and we've got these envelope options within here. Now, if I open this up, this Fidelity Slider is going to make a big difference with how our warps look. So as an example, I'm going to drag this down to 0 just to go from one extreme to another, and I'm going to click OK. I'm going to press A on my keyboard for my direct selection, and I'm going to just click and drag across a row of points here. So I'm going to click and drag basically on alternating rows, and then I'm just going to use my arrow keys to move these rows kind of away from where the text is. And you can see this isn't doing a very good job. It's really distorting the text in a weird way, and it's not really giving us the desired result. So I'm going to press undo a few times. In fact, what I'll do is just create a duplicate. So this is with a really low fidelity, or our fidelity set to 0. I'm going to Alt or Option drag on that text. So we've got we've got it applied again. And the other thing to note is when we're applying these envelope distorts, if you want to just cancel what you've done, if you don't like what it's doing, you can just release the distortion that's going on. So as we were saying before, we had to expand it to actually apply what we were creating as paths. So this isn't actually a destructive method. What we can do is I can also click Reset Envelope Shape. That's also useful. But I can go back up to Object, Envelope Distort, and then Release. So that's just going to actually create a shape from what we've created here. But I'm just going to delete that in this case, and we've still just got our original text here. So let's just go ahead and create that again. Let's go Object, Envelope Distort, Make with Mesh. I'm going to go 4 rows and 1 column again to keep this consistent. Let's go back into our envelope options by clicking that icon up there. And this time I'm going to drag my fidelity all the way to 100. So this is what I would always recommend. I'm not going to lie. I've never found a situation where having it anything less than 100 actually gives nice results. If I'm being completely honest, it just gives for much smoother and more accurate results in my experience. So I'm going to do the exact same thing, click and drag over a row of these mesh points on alternating lines, and this time if I move them out, you can see this is actually doing a much more accurate job of distorting this text in a way that we want, basically. So yeah, it's something I would always check. I think by default it's set to 50, so just check that if you are applying an envelope distort with mesh and you're not getting nice results. Check that, because that can often be the reason why you're not getting nice results with it. So you can see, create some nice wavy text very easily. The exact same thing applies as our last example. I can double click into this and we have our editable text still here. So yeah, very cool. And it can be good for, I'm just applying this to text obviously in this situation, but we can do this with any kind of other vector graphics as well. So you can apply it to, logo designs and icons that you've made as well, very, very easily. So moving on to the last envelope distort option, and that is Make with Top Object. So this is another really useful feature in certain situations. Again, it doesn't always work well, and that's one thing to note with all of these, is that it very much depends on the designs you're working with, how simple they are. If they're, if you're dealing with simple shapes as well, I always think this kind of thing works better with simple geometric shapes than anything too complex. So you can see with our examples here, we have a simple house shape, and we have some more live text. So again, this is just another example that this works with live text. And in this case as well, I've picked a font that's quite bold and has a little bit of roundness to it as well. I find these effects work a little bit a little bit better when we're dealing with something that's not quite as sharp and not quite as detailed in terms of flourishes and things and varying line widths. I think something like a font like this that's very consistent in line width. I also think it works better with slightly heavier fonts as well, so hence what we've got selected here. This font is called Bungee, by the way, and I believe it's a free download from Google Fonts, so if you want to try these out yourself, you could get it from there. So we've got a very simple house shape here, and the idea with make with top object, that option of our envelope distort, is that we can basically place any design into another shape. So it has to be a single path shape, as we'll demonstrate later on. But yeah, we can basically fit this text into this shape. Now, because it's make with top object, we need to always make sure that the object we are fitting a design into is sitting above the other object, if that makes sense. So one thing I always just make sure I do is you can right click, go down to arrange, and then bring to front. So that's just making sure that it's definitely sitting above everything else. And then it's just a case of clicking and dragging over both, going up to object, envelope distort, and then make with top object. So you can see this is working relatively well. I'm just going to press Command Z very quickly. One thing to always think about is the general size or aspect ratio of the item that you're wanting to fit to the shape. If it matches relatively similarly, then it's normally going to work quite well. So in this case, this house shape is quite thin, really, for how wide the text is. So I might get a slightly better result if I was to widen this out a little bit. Let's click and drag on both. It just means it's not going to distort quite as much. It's going to stay slightly truer to the original text proportions. So yeah, this works pretty well. What I can always do is expand this and then go and outline the text and customize it some more. If I wanted to adjust, say, the width of the crossbar on the H, for example, it's maybe a little bit thick, I could quite easily go and edit that in this situation. The other thing to note is that I can also still edit the shape as well that we are containing this within. So again, if I were to double click on this, we're going to get into the object that's being contained within it. So we've got our live text house here. But if I click on the edit envelope option, I keep forgetting what it's called, you can see I can go and grab these points, and you can see by default it gets these Bezier handles applied to it. I'm not sure why that is, but they always get Bezier handles applied, but I can just go and edit them and drag them in if I wanted to. Making a bit of a mess of this right now, so I'm just going to press Command Z a few times. We don't need to do that, but just so you know, you can edit the shapes further if you want to. So we've got another example here, slightly more complex shape. It's not quite as square and in keeping with the, the shape of the text. You could say, obviously text tends to be quite rectangular, but we've got something that's not rectangular at all. So again, this is an example where a font like this is going to work slightly better than something else, and we could do a comparison actually. So let's just duplicate these, and I'm going to select a completely different font for this one. We'll go with something maybe with a little bit more detail, like this script font. So this is maybe going to be a bit of an extreme example, but it's just to show you that it is very much dependent on not only if you're doing it with type, what font you're choosing, what design it is, it's also the shape that we're trying to contain it within. So let's click and drag on the left-hand example, go to Object, Envelope Distort, Make with Top Object, and this has done a pretty good job. You can see it's distorting a lot more than our house example, and that's just to be expected with the shape we're trying to contain it within, but it's still pretty legible. Again, you could go and fine-tune this a little bit more if you wanted to by outlining the text and expanding it and making custom edits yourself. Let's do the same with this text here. Object, Envelope Distort, Make with Top Object, and you can see because the text wasn't really containing a rectangular shape, we've got all this space that sits, where the lowercase text isn't matching the height of the L, for example. So I can press Command Z, and I would never recommend doing this with a script font, but let's just make it all uppercase just for this example. And go back to this, make with top object. You can see it's filling the heart shape more, but it still just looks an absolute mess. You would never actually really be able to tell that this is a heart shape. And that's something where a much bolder font is going to fill that space better. So it's something to always consider. What we can do as well, I'm just thinking I'm going to have to press Command Z a few times. Another thing that I would recommend doing is, if you want to keep a color in behind, is make a duplicate of your heart shape. So I'm just going to press Command C. I'm not going to paste it in yet. Let's just do the same thing of creating our envelope distort, the same way we did before. Now I'm just going to press Command F, or that's Control C and Control F on a PC. I'm going to send this to the back. So the keyboard shortcut to do that, by the way, is Shift, Command, and the left square bracket, or that's Shift, Control, and the left square bracket to send things to the top. So when we're doing these envelope distorts, to send your shapes to the top, it's Shift, Command, and the right square bracket, or Shift, Control, and the right square bracket. So worth noting that. I'm going to select our shape that's in behind, and let's give this a red color. Why not? And what I could do is just quickly create an offset path so that this is sitting slightly larger than our text. Something like that. This is just an example, and there we go. I could double click into this text as well and make it white. And you can see then you've still got your shape sitting in behind that just adds a little bit more shape to the warped text as well. So something worth trying and noting when you're creating these envelope distorts. It is going to get rid of any color properties of the shape you're containing your design within. So here's another example. You can do this with multiple things as well. So we've got two shapes here. We could create some interesting custom type with this. So it's the exact same thing. I'm just going to click and drag over these shapes, make sure they are definitely sitting on top. Let's click and drag over the bottom shape and text first. So you want to do this one at a time. You can't do it all at once. Envelope distort, make with top object, and then the same here, make with top object, and we're getting some interesting looking text this way as well. Now again, we talked about the general shape that the text is making, so you can see our custom lettering is a lot more squeezed and tall looking because it was occupying a wider space before, and now it's been contained in a much smaller or a much thinner object. So again, I could just, with my direct selection tool, click and drag over the top mesh points and actually just bump these down a little bit, so it just matches the general weights of our text below a bit better as well. So yeah, very easy to use. Now here is an example of where it won't work. So as I was saying at the beginning of this, it has to be a single path shape. So we've technically got a compound path here, this kind of donut shape. And if you're not familiar with compound paths, it's basically Illustrator telling it's two paths essentially creating a single shape, or two or more paths, I should say. So we essentially have two paths here, but it's creating a single donut shape. So if I was to try and, well, first of all, let's send this to the top, click and drag over both, envelope distort, make with top object, you can see we're getting this message saying that it has to be a single path. So I'm going to click OK. What I could do is just right click on this and then select release compound path, and that's just going to create a separate circle from the circle that was being punched out of this initially. I'm just going to delete that. Let's click and drag over both, do the same thing, and this time it will work fine. So it's been kind of skewed into that circle, and we've got this kind of spherical looking text. So that's really it. It's these are some excellent features to utilize. Definitely give them a go. We can create some really interesting looking customized type. I think it's especially useful with type. That's why a lot of these examples feature text, but for creating kind of warped custom text, these are really excellent. So what I'm going to do is just jump back to this. Here we go. Let me just very quickly catch up. So yeah, any questions, if anyone's watching this retrospectively as well on our YouTube channel, be sure to drop any comments if you have any questions down below. We always check the comments section regularly, so we'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. And yeah, apart from that, that's probably going to round up today's live Q&A. We also have some free training if you want to learn a little bit more about how to design more effectively. We have a free training where we cover 5 secrets to beautiful design. I will drop a link for that in the chat if you're interested in checking that out. Completely free, but yeah, check it out and see what you think. But I think until next week, guys, I will see you later. All right, catch you later.